Good evening. I'm Steve Target, Chair of the Program Committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to tonight's public affair program. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League, guided by the United States Constitution and the history and values of the Union League of Philadelphia. The Legacy Foundation inspires and educates League members, students, and the greater community to be engaged and responsible citizens. We accomplish this through exhibits, publications, civics education, constitutional programs, scholarships for the citizen leaders of tomorrow, and through lecture programs like tonight's public affairs program. All of our programs that we provide are funded through voluntary contributions of Union League members and others in the community who share in the values of the League. Thank you to all of you who have so generously contributed. Well, yesterday, August 18th, was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed the right for women to vote. So tonight, we thought it was appropriate to commemorate this anniversary with a program on the 19th Amendment and the long struggle that preceded the amendment. Our moderator for this evening, tonight's program, is John Miko. John is the Executive Director of the Legacy Foundation, and I'll now ask John to further introduce our topic and guests. John?
Thank you, Steve. Tonight, I'm really excited about our program because we have two really wonderful and knowledgeable speakers with us this evening. We have Mary Walton and Lucy Beard. Mary and Lucy are wonderfully talented educators and historians. Lucy was the executive director, is the executive director of the Alice Paul Institute in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And she has spent much of her career as a historian and educator, and much of that work is focused on women's history. Most importantly, Lucy was the director of education for the foundations of the Union League several years ago when we opened the Heritage Center. In fact, she was the curator of the very first exhibits in the Russell Hewer Room at the Heritage Center of the Union League of Philadelphia. So welcome, Lucy. And Mary Walton. Mary is a journalist who wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer for many, many years. If you read the Inquirer, you know Mary Walton. She's also has written 5 books, including her latest, which is on the subject of this evening, A Women's Crusade, Alice Paul, and the Battle for the Ballot. Mary, thank you for being with us and welcome. Well, Mary and Lucy, I think you're both on mute. You need to unmute yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
There you are, Lucy.
Thank you.
Yes.
Welcome, Mary. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you.
So one other housekeeping item. For those that are watching on Zoom, you will be able to ask questions. If you go down to the middle, bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A function. Feel free to ask questions all through the program. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the program. So this is a big subject, and a lot of people might think the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, starts in 1848, and I guess in large part that's where we mark it from a historian's perspective. But let's go back, Lucy, a little bit further. Let's go back actually a lot further. Let's go back to the founding of the Republic, to the Constitution. Give us a little history of voting rights more generally pre-1848. What did it look like? Who could vote? Where could they vote? What did the states have to say? Give us a little bit of that history before we jump specifically into Seneca Falls, 1848, and then get into the women's suffrage movement as we typically think about it.
Right. Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having us tonight and exploring this topic, one of my favorites. When the founding fathers got together to frame the Constitution, they had a lot of questions about how would we consent to be governed? Who should vote? How should they vote? And they really wrestled with these questions and wondered about the rights of minorities. However, in their day, minorities meant those people who owned land. And if you gave the vote to everyone, the property owners would be overrun by the votes of those who did not, the majority of those who did not own land. And Madison, I found this quote recently, and I love it. Madison wrote, "The right of suffrage is a fundamental article in Republican constitutions. The regulation of it is, at the same time, a task of peculiar delicacy. allowed the right to vote exclusively to property owners, and the rights of persons may be oppressed, extended equally to all, and the rights of property owners may be overruled by a majority without property. So that's how Madison felt about it. And eventually they left the details about voting to the states. They just kind of punted that one or kicked it down the can down the road. So each state came up with their own rules. And many of the people on tonight may not know, and they may have a connection to New Jersey, but in New Jersey, when the Constitution of New Jersey was created in the 1770s or 80s, anyone who had property and cash worth $250 could vote. So there were women voting in New Jersey. There were free Blacks voting in New Jersey, as well as, less than super wealthy, though $250 was a pretty substantial sum. And women were voting through the 1780s and 90s and into 1800 in New Jersey. The first women in the Western world to vote were New Jersey girls. But in 1805, that became something of an issue, and a particular member of the State House claimed that there had been fraud in the recent election and it must be the women's fault. And he put forth a bill that passed through both houses of the state legislature and took away the right to vote. So for the next 30, 40 years, New Jersey women were campaigning to regain the vote, something most people don't know about. And that was their messaging, was around, we need to regain the vote. And then gradually, they quelled that campaign and focused more on what was becoming a national movement. And by 1848 to 50, the word was getting around the country. And I thought I'd hand it over to Mary to talk more about the national scene at that point.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. So clearly, women voting was not a new idea in 1848, but what happened was a meeting was called by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and several other women in Seneca Falls, New York. This is known as the Women's Rights Convention. And it was more than just voting, but voting among 9 resolutions that were passed to advance the cause of women. Voting was the only one that was not passed by the convention by a unanimous vote. Interestingly, Frederick Douglass was the only Black person present at that meeting, and he was a great ally of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other abolitionists who were present, and he did in fact vote for that resolution. And that resolution said that the women of the country had the duty to secure for themselves what it was called the sacred right to the elective franchise. So voting was thought to be a sacred right, which is heavy duty language indeed. We see here on the upper left, Sojourner Truth, great abolitionist of a slave who escaped slavery and worked to free her brothers and sisters, and also famous for a quote at a meeting where she was sort of dissed and where she said, "Ain't I a woman?" And that's a little in question because she was raised in New York State and there was some question about whether she would have used that grammatical construct, but she's famous for it. Then to the right, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and on the bottom, we have the great Susan B. Anthony.
And we can thank Donald Trump for pardoning Susan B. Anthony.
Hey.
Yes, well, I wanted to mention that because it's relevant in the sense that there was a movement late in the 1800s, specifically around the election of 1872, when Grant was running against Horace Greeley, newspaperman, for women to vote. And it wasn't just Susan B. Anthony, but Susan B. Anthony got most of the ink because she was already famous. Mm-hmm. And she dared to strong arm some registrars in her hometown of Rochester, New York, into allowing her to register and then allowing her to vote. And they were all arrested for having done that. Went to trial, all found guilty. The three registrars went to jail. Susan B. Anthony was, well, they were fined $25. They didn't have the money, so they went to jail. And Susan B. Anthony was fined $100 and said, I will never pay that fine. And she never did. And she was never apprehended for her crime. The three registrars were pardoned, but Anthony was not, although she did seek a pardon. Perhaps because she'd never paid her fine. I'm not clear on the legalese for that, until our president yesterday pardoned Susan B. Anthony. Some question of how she would have felt about that, but indeed she is now no longer, I guess, a felon.
So, Lucy, let me ask you a question. Mary mentioned a couple of very famous abolitionists, not the least of which is Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott, and others. What was the relationship at that time between the abolitionists, suffragists? Where did they, or they weren't called that, I guess, yet, but at that time, what were they doing together, and where did they like maybe diverge? Well,
they were one and the same, really, through the suffrage movement came out of the abolition movement. Stanton and met Lucretia Mott at an abolition conference. And then they got together a few years later and decided to do Seneca Falls. So they were really hand in glove up until post-Civil War and the amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendment. And Mary, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that at all?
Well, the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship, was the amendment on which Susan B. Anthony made her case that she was entitled to vote because she was indeed a citizen. And the federal judge in that case ruled that voting was not the right of an American citizen. So, and that later became important case law in denying the right to vote to women. Men got the vote, Black men, of course, white men had the vote, Black men got the vote under the 15th Amendment. And that was really divided the suffrage movement because Stanton and Anthony believed strongly and worked hard to convince Congress that women should also have that right under the 15th Amendment. And they failed that cause, and it divided the women's movement over whether that was a good way to go or not. And it held back the cause of suffrage really for the rest of the century, which takes us sort of into the 19th century when both these heroines pass, Anthony in 1906 and Elizabeth Cady Stanton before her. And this period becomes known as the doldrums in suffrage history because nothing much happened. And really nothing much did happen until Alice Paul arrives on the scene. Now, Alice Paul, and this is also—
Before we do that, can I interrupt, Mary? Because go back, Lucy, go back to that map.
If I can, I think. Whoop, sorry.
Oh, no, there we go. Just explain what that is and give us a timeline on a time frame on that.
Oh, well, I was gonna mention Wyoming because Wyoming was the first state in 1869 where women got the vote, and that was kind of interesting. Wyoming was a gold rush state, and the population then was 6-to-1 male to female, and so the men in the state thought it might be a good idea to have more women come to Wyoming, and that if women had the vote, that would improve the state's image and encourage women to immigrate to Wyoming. And so Wyoming was still a territory at the time, but it did approve women's suffrage. And women like Wyoming women like to point out that they could vote 50 years before the rest of American women got the vote. I think it was 1890, Wyoming qualified to become a state. It had sufficient population, and there was a movement on Congress that there were members who didn't like the idea that women had the vote. And the politician who would become the governor famously declared that if Wyoming women, or he said that Wyoming would not even consider coming into the Union if its women couldn't come in with the vote. So Wyoming retained the vote. It was followed by three other Western states, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. So you can see in this, this wonderful graphic that the voting for women began in the West because other states, those that you see on the map, eventually ahead of the 19th Amendment, voted in their state to give the privilege of voting to women in their state constitution. So you see the women on the right speaking out for it.
Right. So we have voting rights being extended to women in the Western states throughout the latter part of the 19th century into the 20th, correct? But not in the Eastern states.
There was some limited suffrage, like maybe school board elections, something local elections, but this is, these states here, it's federal elections, all of them.
And Mary, let me go back to something that you mentioned earlier. So there's this divide at the time of the passage of the 15th Amendment, which is African American men's voting. And then we see over the next 50, 60 years, or 50 years or so, voting rights being extended in Western states, not in Eastern states. But what's happening with the movement more generally? Is it a state by state movement? Is it a federal movement? What's happening there?
Okay, the big suffrage organization of the day, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, worked for what was called, people called it the state by state approach. It was an effort to get suffrage approved by the electorate, all male, and into the state constitution. And that was a movement that was largely successful in Western states. And so by the around 1910, 1912 was when that organization held its national convention in Philadelphia. There were 9 states, all from the West, where women could vote in federal elections. But no, not in the cradle of democracy, not in the 13 colonies. None of those states gave women the vote.
So let's get to our protagonist. Let's get to our hero of the evening, Alice Paul. So who is this Quaker from New Jersey, Alice Paul?
Alice Paul, born and raised in this beautiful house, which is now the Alice Paul Institute, where Lucy is the executive director. So she's born here in 1885. She is born into a fairly strict Quaker family, Hicksite Quakers, if that means anything. And she goes to Quaker schools. And that's, of course, is Alice on the left. She's the oldest of 4 children. And she loved this house. She liked to sit out on that veranda and read. The house was also called the home farm. Is that what they called it?
Yeah, she called it the home farm, but Paul.
Home farm, right, because it was a farm.
Homestead.
Yeah, 160 plus acres. Her father, though, was a banker in nearby Moorestown, so they were a fairly prosperous family. But she was raised with all the good Quaker values, one of which, of course, was equality, absolute equality, regardless of gender, regardless of creed, regardless of ethnicity. So that was certainly part of her background from the family and also in her schooling. So she attends Swarthmore College. It admitted women. Haverford, on the other side of Philadelphia, Quaker College, did not admit women. And her family had been influential, her grandfather, in raising funds to establish Swarthmore. And her mother, Tacy Paul, in fact, had gone there until she got married, and married women weren't allowed to continue as students. I don't know about the men. At any rate,
it was fun.
So after Swarthmore, she takes a turn at social work in New York City. It's not for her because, in her words, it didn't change anything in the lives of the poor women who, of course, she was helping in her profession of social work. There was a college of philanthropy in New York, and she attended classes there. She came back to Pennsylvania. She enrolled at University of Pennsylvania for her master's degree in sociology. And then she has the opportunity to study abroad. And she thinks that will be good because she can learn languages there, principally German. She spent a while in Germany, but she enrolled in a Quakers Institute in England. And it's in England that she got involved in the militant suffrage movement, the Women's Social and Political Union, founded by a woman named Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, 3 daughters. So Alice, in that period of time, Alice was actually a very reserved and shy young woman. And she started out selling newspapers on street corners. That was something she got accustomed to, although it made her very edgy at first. And she began speaking on street corners, and she did that so well. She was invited to speak at political meetings, and these are suffrage meetings, of course, and women were forbidden to speak at political meetings. They were arrested. And in that year, 1909, when she was active, she was arrested 7 times, went to jail 3 times. Women prisoners were demanding to be treated as political prisoners, as men were. They were turned down in protest. They went on hunger strikes, and they were force-fed. Force feeding was a grim procedure. A tube was forced down the nose with a funnel at the top, and liquid food poured through the funnel, through the tube into the nose. And it was extremely painful. Alice wrote back home to her mother, Tacy, who didn't know what to do with this new information about her daughter, who'd always been such a good girl. Alice said she never went through that process without tears streaming down her face. And that was very un-Alice.
Let me understand. So she's in London.
Yes.
Give me a year here. This is early 1909. She's protesting for women's rights in London. This is an international movement, correct, Lucy?
Well, it was, I wouldn't call it an international movement. They may have been aware of each other, but it was really homegrown in the different countries, I would say. Wouldn't you, Mary? I mean,
yes, definitely.
But what was happening in England was far more militant than anything happening in America. The English movement frightened the American suffragists. They didn't want any part of that. And in England, by the way, I think people would be interested to know, they were called suffragettes, E-T-T-E. And that was a diminutive term to diminish the women and their importance. In America, they were very careful to call themselves suffragists. In England, they just adopted it sort of as a, thumb in the eye that, okay, call us suffragettes, that's what we'll be. But in were careful to call them, as they wanted to be called, suffragists.
So what is the difference what are they doing differently in the United States and in Great Britain? What is the difference?
Well, I would say they were doing very polite lobbying in relation. In England, it was a PR campaign to get the issue of suffrage out in the public eye and keep it there. And there were news blackouts routinely. So their methods just got more and more aggressive in order that they couldn't be ignored. Now, while Alice was there, we would look at it not as aggressive by today's terms. She was doing things like leading marches, and they fully expected when they went out on a march, she described to her mother in a letter that she would wear every article of clothing she had and multiple coats to protect herself, because they knew they were going to get beaten with billy clubs by the police and by bystanders. So there was just a more violent tone to it in England, and the women responded in kind. Well, not in kind, they weren't violent, but the violence was being perpetrated upon them. And when Alice came back here, she had to explain that to the Quaker community that was questioning her. But I don't want to take away from
Yeah. So let's go back. So Alice is in London. She's participating in the movement in London. When does she come back to the States, and then how does she really become a central figure in the movement here in the United States?
Yeah, well, we're fortunate to have this portrait of her on board boat coming back to the United States in 1910. And she comes back and she enrolls once again at Penn, and she's going to work for her PhD. And she does work for her PhD because she has decided suffrage as a career is not real promising, and she'll become an academic. But she cannot stay away from suffrage, and she recruits a young woman from Brooklyn that they have met at police headquarters in London to join her in the summer of 1911. And together they stage Philadelphia's first street corner campaign. And there's a description of how they went about in a horse-drawn cart, and this picture hangs in Philadelphia City Hall in the Visitors Center, and you know it has to be the same cart that they went around from street corner to street corner, and they did that throughout the summer. I thought it was very successful. They reached a lot of people. It seemed far preferable to holding these stodgy suffrage meetings in halls. A lot of men, and they were very responsive. So, despite that success, Alice thinks that this kind of campaigning is not hugely successful, because this was designed to win suffrage in the state of Pennsylvania and to get it shoehorned into the Constitution. And the problem with the approach was that it was, you had to convince a male legislature to put it on the ballot, and then you had to convince male voters to authorize it. And so it was all up to the men, plus which it got tangled up with the Prohibition movement. And the liquor lobby would throw a lot of money into various states to publicize anti-suffrage.
Why, Mary?
Good question. They thought if women got the vote, women would vote for prohibition. It's just straight calculus, and so that hurt the campaign a lot. So
who else in terms of men? You can. There's plenty of men, I'm sure, but what are the other kind of groups of people that would be in opposition, organized groups or maybe unorganized groups in opposition to women's suffrage?
Well, there was a strong anti-suffrage movement composed of both men and women. And there was the Women's Christian Temperance Union for prohibition. And those were the two main ones, but people often want to know, why would people oppose suffrage? What were the arguments against it? And I have a quick checklist. Women did not really want the vote. They would vote as men did, so it was a waste of votes, succeeding only in doubling the cost of elections. And the big one is that the woman's place was in the home, taking care of the family, taking care of her husband, preparing the food, and voting would be just a terrible, terrible distraction from domestic responsibilities. Emotion would govern their decisions, and they were just ill-equipped for the rough and tumble of politics, the world of politics.
So that was almost like the popular culture response to it. But in any kind of a campaign like this, it's the money that counts. And the money came from the liquor companies, really. I don't think there was any other organized corporate, I'll call it.
Corporate money, no. But
Yeah.
it was big money.
Yeah, yeah.
So many people didn't think they were rough and tumble enough, yet we go into the next part of this story and it gets pretty rough and tumble, correct? So they take this from a state level led by Alice Paul to a federal level, and they go right for the big amendment. And so tell us that story and what happens then.
Well, she gets permission from that big organization I mentioned, the National, to represent them in Washington. They do have a constitutional committee. The federal amendment that we have today was written in 1887, and is sometimes called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because she campaigned for it so strongly, and it was voted on once in the Senate. 1887, roundly defeated, takes a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, and never voted on again. But it would come up every year, and this little congressional committee would, lobby for it. But Alice and Lucy got themselves appointed head of the congressional committee with a pledge to really push for the federal amendment.
You're talking about Lucy Burns.
Lucy.
Right. The other Lucy.
Lucy Burns.
Yeah, right.
So the first thing they do, and it's Alice's inspiration, is they're going to hold a big suffrage parade on the day before the new president, Woodrow Wilson, takes office. So the parade is scheduled for March 3rd. We're up to 1913. And you can see here that it gets off to a very orderly start. It's Alice organized it in just 2 months, really. And she was afraid not many people would come or participate, so she wanted it to be beautiful. And it was beautiful, but up to 8,000 women came, and 250,000 people, bystanders, onlookers, arrived as well. So it was a big deal. You can see here that the crowd is massing in front of the parade, and it reaches the point where they basically almost halt the parade. It comes to a trickle. And this banner, which is at the head of the parade, says, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country." They were putting Wilson on notice that women wanted the vote. And this parade held the day before his inauguration was a message to Wilson and the new Congress.
What had Wilson said about this issue previously?
Wilson had managed to say almost nothing. It didn't come up essentially in his campaign. And when questioned about it, as he would be in years to come, he always said the same thing. He said that it was up to the states. Wilson was a Virginian, he was a states writer, and it wasn't the job of the chief executive. It was the state's call, and it wasn't in the Democratic Party platform either. And he was, of course, a slave to the Democratic Party platform. And that was the argument he made in frequent meetings, demonstrations, 4 years of lobbying. The women were superb lobbyists. And Alice would do anything, and this parade was an example, to keep the issue in front of the public, just to keep it alive. And she
From a partisan perspective, where did the parties stand on this issue? Was there a difference in their stance on women's suffrage between the Republican Democratic Party?
Yes, it was still the party of Lincoln, the Republicans. A lot of Republicans supported suffrage. The Democrats were the majority, big majority in 1913 and for years afterwards. The Southern Democrats held the power in the Congress, in the House, and they did not want to see Black women get the vote. And they were very open about that. And they were, the South was solidly against suffrage.
Well, and this is 1912 is the Bull Moose breakaway, right? And
Right.
Roosevelt did endorse suffrage.
Yes, he did.
In favor of it in his campaign. He didn't win, so.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah, that split the Republican Party.
right.
Yeah, his candidacy.
So Wilson is inaugurated,
Yes,
and then what?
the frequent meetings.
Boy, I anticipated
okay.
that slide. I didn't see it before, Lucy.
Well, we can go to this. 4 years go by when
Yeah.
basically Alice Paul does a lot. She even sends her young volunteers out west to campaign in those Western states where women had the vote to campaign against Democrats. But there's still almost no movement in the US Congress and no movement at all by the president. So January 10th, 1917, 12 women march across Lafayette Park from suffrage headquarters, and they're carrying these signs almost as big as they are. And they take up positions at the two gates of the White House, and they do not speak. They call themselves silent sentinels. The New York Times comes and calls them silent sentinels, calls them silent, silly, and offensive. And
This was a new tactic, not just for the women's suffrage movement, but for political movements generally. This had not been done before, correct?
the first people ever to pick at the White House. Yes. And this is January. It was cold. People brought them hot bricks, supporters, hot bricks to stand on. They passed around a fur coat that was lent to the campaign. And except for a small break in early winter, they are out there every day through November. But the arrests start in June, because what happened was that you will recall World War I became a factor in this campaign. And Wilson, in his war message, called upon Congress to make the world safe for democracy. And he gave the women a great gift with that statement, because they began to put messages on their signs. How can America be a democracy if 20 million American women cannot vote? And they were exposing Wilson for his hypocrisy. This got them in a lot of trouble because we were at war, and once they'd been objects of curiosity, now they look like traitors, picketing a sitting president in time of war, right? So they mobs begin to gather, and the women are attacked, and their offensive banners are torn down from their poles, and they're hurled to the ground, and they suffer injuries. and they are arrested.
And on what grounds are they arrested?
Well, they,
Traffic.
parties, right, have a little trouble with that one because they haven't been doing anything illegal. It's a pretty big sidewalk. They're arrested for obstructing traffic. It's a misdemeanor.
Mm-hmm.
The first sentences are very light, 3 days. But what happens to women? They take, they can pay the fine or do the time. They do the time. They come back, and they're out on the picket line again. And over the course of the summer, the sentences get longer and longer. The leaders by October get 7 months. That's Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Her people didn't want Alice to picket because they thought she should stay in headquarters and run things. But she, I don't know, I think she couldn't resist the action.
So Mary, Lucy, tell me, so why does it matter, right? So they're picketing, they're protesting, they're arrested. What's happening in the coverage of this? What is the public seeing? How are they reacting? What's going on beyond what's happening in front of the White House and in DC? What's happening to public opinion in the United States at that point? Is it changing?
Yeah, it is. And what they were most effective at, and Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and the organization they started, because they basically got invited to leave National because of their tactics. But what they're doing is effectively keeping the issue in the public eye. And that's exactly where they want to keep it. And they make some people feel uncomfortable with their tactics. It's considered unseemly, but they also win a lot of hearts and minds around the country, particularly when women are in jail and it's getting out to the newspapers what the conditions are like, how poorly they're being treated. And then they go on hunger strike and they're being force fed, and people are reading about this in the newspapers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they move from this moment into actually action to change the law and get the amendment passed? What happens next that creates the momentum and the political movement to make this happen?
Right. Well, the whole time they're doing this, I'll call it street theater, and I don't mean to diminish it in that way, but the whole time they're doing this, in the background, there's the national organization lobbying hard and looking very moderate and easy to work with. So I think it was a counterpunch between the two different organizations. And while Alice Paul, the national leaders hated her, they felt she was hurting things, but she was pushing the envelope and making their campaign easier for Wilson and the authorities to swallow, I think. Would you agree, Mary?
Yes, and the really important thing that happened at the time that these women are serving the ultimate jail term where they're really badly mistreated and all this news leaks out, women win the vote in New York State.
Yeah.
This is huge. This means you have over 40 members of Congress who have to support suffrage or they're not going to be reelected. And this message is not lost on all the other members of Congress. They put pressure on Wilson. And suddenly Wilson changes his mind. Mm-hmm. Yes, women should have the vote. And he's asked what happened to states' rights, right? And he says, oh, this is a national issue.
Right.
This is the national constitution.
Right? Yeah, he calls it a war measure to thank the for supporting the war effort. So
yeah,
he pushes it through as a war measure. Yeah.
So talk though a little bit about the, how does it get ratified? What's the ratification process? It's been an amendment now for a long time, right? It's been a proposed amendment for a long time. What happens? Bring us up to yesterday, 100 years ago, if you can, in kind of the constitutional process and how that happened.
Do you want to do Tennessee, Lucy?
Yeah, oh, please let me. Yeah. It goes, so Wilson talks about the war measure in January of 18. I think it's in February, isn't it, Mary, when the House of Representatives passes the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. But then it takes another 16 months till June 4th, 1919 for the Senate to pass it. And there are dramatic stories of senators coming in from their wives' deathbeds to vote for it, or coming on off their own deathbeds to vote against it, that kind of thing. It's very dramatic. The National Woman's Party, Alice Paul's organization, is still picketing in front of the White House on and off. And then it goes out to the states to be ratified. And at that time, it required 36 states for ratification, 2/3 of the states. And there are states that race to be the first ones to ratify it. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, I think, were in a race to get there. And of course, it gets automatically ratified by the 10, 12 states that already had suffrage. So it's going along at a good clip. And up through in February of 1920, February 9th, it's ratified in New Jersey. And then when does it hit Delaware, Mary? It gets to Delaware. It
gets to Delaware in March, and it stays there till April when it's defeated.
Yeah.
And they were counting on that. That was going to be the 36th state, because there just weren't any other prospects.
Because the rest were southern states. Yeah, they wouldn't go. So then they've got one possibility in the South. Now the Delaware has nixed it. And they all had all these suffragists swoop down on Nashville, Tennessee for the summer of 1920. And it's back and forth. And there's a great book that came out in the last 2-3 years called The Woman's Hour that is about that we hear is going to be made into a movie. The rights have been purchased. And it's a high drama story. The national organization is down there. Alice Paul has lieutenants all over the state working on it. And it comes down to the night before the vote. And it looks like a tie. And the next day, there's some wrangling, but basically it comes down to the youngest member of the House changes his mind. And he was an anti, and he votes yes, much to the surprise of everyone in the room. And that's how we got the vote. And he had gotten a letter from his mother the night before saying, do right by the ladies and put the rat in ratification, Harry. And he did. He listened to his mother. Yesterday, that was August 18th, 1920. And that's the day the 36th state ratified it. It's interesting that we've never recognized August 18th as a significant day until this year. And I thank the Tennessee Visitors Bureau and everything for that. I think it's a very effective campaign on making us think that's how we got the vote, because Tennessee, around here in New Jersey, we look at that as a participation trophy. They get it for being the 36th, Let's give Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and the other 35 states a little more credit.
So let's move. I have some really good questions. Let's move to a few questions that we have from our audience. One, I have 3 or 4 questions around the Women's Christian Temperance Union. What's wrong with those people? Why are they opposing? Give us a little bit more information on their opposition to.
They didn't oppose it. I think that was a misstatement.
Okay, good. Okay,
didn't mean that. Yeah, they were supporters, and they shared a lot of members. I know Susan B. Anthony was a member of the WCTU, right, Mary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
was active in that. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
That was careful listening.
Yes, it was. And then another question that's come up a couple times in our Zoom questions are about African-American voting generally, specifically, of course, women voting, but it could be extended to men, of course. What happened there politically? In fact, of course, African-Americans, men and women, could not effectively vote in the South, and for another 30, 40 years. What happened there in terms of the movement itself? What went wrong, I guess, in a sense?
Mary, do you want to take it? I mean, I'll kick it off and then you take over, or the other way around.
Why don't you say what you think, and if I have anything to add, I'll come in.
All right. So African-American women were working on suffrage as part of their club movement all through the 1800s and into the 1900s. They created organizations, and suffrage was always an important issue in those organizations because of the general climate in the country. There was very little integration between their organizations and white women's organizations. That's just the way it was, unfortunately. By 1910, there was some cross over between them. I don't mean to state that they were totally segregated, but they were not in general. There was no one integrated organization. Alice Paul and the National, both of them were firmly for the vote for all women. They were not addressing the race issue. Alice Paul gets to Washington in 1913. She is 28 years old. She's a young woman suddenly on the national stage. And Washington is a very Southern town. And all she knows is she's going to create a big parade and get suffrage back on the front page of the newspaper, because it hasn't been there. It's been the doldrums, and it hasn't been a national issue for years at that point, since Anthony's death 7 years earlier. She is confronted with the racism of Washington as a Southern city, really. And there are many wealthier supporters in the city who approach her and say, this can't be an integrated parade you're having. At the same time, she's getting approached by sororities from the new sororities at the Howard University who want to be part of this parade. And she's really confronted with this situation and doesn't know what to do. But she listens to the people who are writing the checks and says, I'm just not going to do anything, and let's just ignore this. She tries to just withdraw from any decision making. There is stuff out there now, Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is stuff out there where she told people, those sororities, to march at the back of the parade. We're looking for that documentation because we haven't really found it, to my knowledge. Mary, if you correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, no, it's really alarming to hear that. Another part of that was Ida Wells Barnett came down from Chicago, and she was the founder of the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago. She came with the Illinois delegation, and word came through, and my research showed that it was word from the National, someone at the National saying that Ida had to march at the back of the parade, and she said she would never do that. But now I hear her say, well, Alice Paul said that, told Ida she had to march at the back of the, it did not happen. But, and what did happen is that Ida Wells Barnett just kind of disappeared before the parade. And then she slipped in with the Illinois delegation as it went by and marched the march with the Illinois group.
What we do know is Alice said, she told a supporter, we can have a white procession, we can have a Negro procession, or we can have no procession. And then she tried to absent herself, and she was wrong. We can all say that now. She was naive. She felt that being a Quaker spoke for itself. She felt that if women got the vote, they could address issues like racism. But the two were not combined in her mind. She was single focused on suffrage and felt that would solve so many of the other issues.
So I have a question about men in the 19th Amendment. Any stories of men who were leaders in this movement? And give us a taste for maybe some of the men who are feeling left out tonight.
There's a great book by a professor in New York State named Susan Goodyear called Suffragents that talks about the men in the movement. There were men's clubs, there were men for suffrage. There was a lot of that. And in the 1913 parade that Alice Paul planned, there were men's delegations. In fact, there was talk that, they could put the men's delegations in between the women's delegation, the Southern women's delegations and the Black women's delegations in the parade, just to protect everybody, separate them. So I can't come up with any specific anecdotes. Maybe you can, Mary. There was.
Yeah, probably the most prominent was an Irish politician named Dudley Field Malone. And he had a post a patronage post from Wilson as collector of the Port of New York. It paid very well, very prestigious. He was a lawyer, and he advised Wilson during the re-election campaign of 1916 to support women's suffrage. And he thought he had Wilson's agreement, and he did not. And he was so disillusioned that he quit his post and he allied with Alice Paul and her group, and he defended them when they went to jail, and he went on the road giving talks for suffrage. It did turn out that he was or would become romantically involved with one of the very, very attractive suffragists, Doris Stevens.
Yeah.
But that doesn't discount the work that he did. And once when I was doing research up in the library of the Alice Paul Institute, I came across a book he'd written, and he autographed it to Alice Paul, and it said something like, "To Alice, those were the days!" Exclamation point, Dudley Field Malone.
So Lucy, how old is Alice Paul in 1920?
In 1920, she would have been 35 years old.
So what did she do for the next 50 years or so?
Sure, yeah. So most of the suffragists after August 26, 1920, and August 26th is the day it actually became signed into the US Constitution. So we have another party next Wednesday coming up. Most of the suffragists packed their bags and went home, so we've won. But not Alice Paul. She was already focused on the next goal, which was really to enshrine legal equality in our Constitution, regardless of gender. Everyone is equal. Because we don't have that in our Constitution. So she went on a campaign. She decided she needed to understand the law. So in the 1920s, she attended law school at American University, and by 1928 had finished a doctorate in law. We don't know that she ever took a bar exam. She was a legal scholar. She used her legal knowledge to work with the National Woman's Party, which retooled itself to work for a new constitutional amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment. And she had that introduced into Congress by Susan B. Anthony's nephew in 1923. And she worked for the Equal Rights Amendment to be passed by Congress for the next 49 years, till it finally passed in 1972. The National Woman's Party impacted hundreds of pieces of legislation that addressed issues around women's property ownership and inheritance laws, citizenship laws. When an American woman who married a man born in another country would lose her American citizenship prior to, and so they were very active with lobbying. They were known for their lobbying techniques, and that became sort of the model for how to effectively lobby the Congress, and they always worked with Congress. So that was for the next 40 years. In the late 30s, she created the World Women's Party to go to the League of Nations and lobby there for gender equality to be put in its charter and impact other countries' constitutions. But World War II caught up with her, and she came back to this country in 1941 and continued lobbying the League up in Montreal, where it was moved during the war. And then she was influential with the UN Charter of Human Rights, or Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations Charter, getting gender equality inserted in that. And in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there is Title VII, I believe it is about gender equality, guaranteeing non-discrimination based on gender in the workplace, and which to this day is the only federal protection you have against gender employment discrimination based on gender. So she was active well into the 1960s and finally retired in 1972. And
if people want to know more about Alice Paul, a great place to do that would be.
There you go, alicepaul.org. Thank you, John.
And you are, what is your current status given COVID and everything else?
We are doing a lot of online programming. You go to our events page on our website and you'll see we have a program on Thursday, tomorrow night, Your Voice, Your Vote, about women and voting issues in 2020, what to look for. We also have a second website, equalrightsamendment.org, that will tell you about the Equal Rights Amendment, which is still in play. It passed out of Congress in 72. It was given a 10-year time limit to be ratified by 38 states. And in 1982, it was 3 states short. So, but since 2017, 3 more states have ratified it. So it is, it's come back around and for consideration. So stay tuned.
And Mary, where can people find your great book?
Well, at all the online booksellers, basically.
Including alicepaul.org/gift shop.
Of course, yes.
Mary and Lucy, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I hope we can be back at the Union League soon doing this in person and programs like this. We are working, and Lucy, you've been very helpful in the development of the next exhibit at the Heritage Center, which is on voting rights. Really, it's a history of voting rights from 1789 right up to the present. And a big part of that story, of course, is the 19th Amendment. So thank you for everything you've done to help us with that. That is going to open on September 24th, and we hope very much that people can actually see it in person on September 24th. So you can go to ulheritagecenter.org to learn more about that exhibit and all the great work of the Legacy Foundation. So Mary and Lucy, thank you again for your time and your work on this great subject, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you, John. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. So we have more programs brought to you by the Legacy Foundation coming up. We have a program tomorrow evening, a library hour with Charlie Duff. It's about architecture and development of the American cities and other cities and the architecture of those cities. That's at 6 o'clock. You can go to, you can get an invitation from us if you go to the heritagecenter.org site, or you can always view our programs on YouTube. And then next Wednesday, we have a Civil War Roundtable with Bernard Kempinski on the railroads and the Civil War. It should be a great program. That's next Wednesday. So until then, we thank you for being with us this evening, and we hope to see you tomorrow night for our library hour. Good night.